Thugs bully an old black man, not realizing he's a Vietnam veteran. The old man sat quietly on the nearly full bus, his gaze fixed on the world passing by outside the smudged window. His hands rested on the head of his cane, steady and strong despite the years etched into his dark skin. Ernest Turner had lived through it all: Jim Crow, Vietnam, and decades of quiet resilience in a world that often failed to recognize his worth. At 76, he didn't ask for much. Today, he was simply heading home after visiting his grandson, who had recently started college. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. The bus came to a stop, and two teenagers climbed aboard, their voices loud and boisterous. Both were white, dressed in oversized hoodies and sneakers, their energy radiating arrogance as they scanned the crowded bus for seats. Their eyes landed on Ernest, sitting calmly in the middle of the bus. "Hey, old man," one of them said, his voice dripping with mockery as he pointed to Ernest's seat. "Why don't you let us have that spot? You don't need it." Ernest didn't immediately respond. He turned his head slightly, his sharp, weathered eyes meeting the boys. "This seat's taken," he said simply, his voice low and steady. The second teen stepped forward, a sneer spreading across his face. "Don't you know who's in charge here, old man? You better move before we make you." The other passengers began shifting uncomfortably, some casting worried glances toward Ernest, while others stared resolutely out the window, pretending not to notice. No one stepped in. Ernest sighed, a deep, weary sound, and adjusted his position slightly. "I've seen boys like you before," he said, his voice calm but firm, "thinking the world owes you something just for walking through it. But let me tell you something, son. I earned this seat." "Earned?" the first teen scoffed. "What, by sitting around all day?" Ernest tilted his head, studying them for a long moment. Then, slowly, he leaned his cane against the seat and pulled up the sleeve of his worn jacket, revealing a faded tattoo on his forearm. It was the insignia of the United States Marine Corps. Below it were scars, thick, pale ridges crisscrossing his dark skin, each one telling a story of survival. "I earned it fighting for a country that didn't always fight for me," he said, his voice as steady as a drumbeat. "I earned it crawling through the jungles of Vietnam with bullets flying past my head and my brothers falling around me. And I earned it watching men like me bleed for freedoms that people like you take for granted." The bus fell silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed quieter as the weight of his words sank in. The second teen shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering. "Whatever, man," he muttered, though his voice had lost its edge. Ernest didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into the boys. "You think respect is a game? You think it's something you can take from me? Let me teach you something your mama should have taught you. Respect isn't just given, it's earned. And right now, boy, you haven't earned a thing." The first teen opened his mouth to retort, but the bus driver's voice cut through the tension. "If you two don't stop harassing this man, you're getting off at the next stop. I don't care where you're headed." The teenagers froze, looking around the bus. For the first time, they noticed the glares from other passengers. Embarrassed and unsure, they backed away, retreating to the standing section near the rear of the bus. Ernest watched them go, his expression unreadable. Then he adjusted his sleeve, picked up his cane, and leaned back in his seat, as calm as he had been before. A young woman seated across from him leaned forward. "Sir," she said softly, "thank you for everything you've done. You shouldn't have had to deal with that." Ernest gave her a small, knowing smile. "Life's full of battles," he said. "Some you fight with bullets, others you fight with words. The important thing is knowing which ones are worth the fight." As the bus rolled on, the atmosphere slowly returned to normal, but a quiet respect lingered in the air. Ernest gazed out the window again, his thoughts returning to his grandson, the next generation who would carry on his legacy of resilience and quiet strength. He didn't need a medal or a parade to validate his worth. He had already lived a life of service, courage, and dignity, and no words from foolish boys could ever take that away from him. As the bus continued its journey, Ernest remained seated, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside. Though outwardly calm, his mind churned with memories, both bitter and sweet. He had faced far worse than a couple of brash teenagers. Racism at its ugliest, the chaos of war, and the quiet struggle of rebuilding a life after returning home to a country that didn't fully embrace him. Yet, he endured, not out of spite, but out of a steadfast belief in his own dignity. The bus made another stop, and the two teenagers, still standing in the back, shifted awkwardly. They whispered to each other, stealing occasional glances at Ernest. Their earlier bravado had drained away, leaving behind a mix of guilt and embarrassment. One of the boys, Tyler, felt especially uneasy. His father was a veteran too, and though they rarely spoke about it, he knew the sacrifices military men and women made. He'd let his temper and arrogance get the better of him, and now he felt the sting of shame. As the bus began moving again, Tyler nudged his friend, Justin, and muttered something. Justin frowned but reluctantly followed as Tyler approached Ernest's seat. The other passengers noticed the movement, some tensing in anticipation of more trouble. "Excuse me, sir," Tyler said, his voice quieter now. We just wanted to say we're sorry for how we acted. It was wrong and we shouldn't have disrespected you like that." Justin nodded, though his words came slower. "Yeah, we were out of line. We didn't know. Well, we didn't think." Ernest turned his head, his piercing gaze locking onto Tyler's eyes first, then Justin's. He studied them for a moment, letting the weight of their apology settle. Finally, he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Then, leaning slightly forward, he added, "But remember, respect isn't just about words, it's about actions. You'll meet a lot of people in this world who are different from you. Don't judge them by what you see or think you know. Judge them by what they do. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Tyler said, his voice earnest. Ernest's stern expression softened slightly. "Good. Now go sit down before this bus driver decides to make you walk the rest of the way." A ripple of subdued laughter passed through the bus, breaking the tension. Tyler and Justin returned to their spot near the back, their shoulders hunched but their expressions reflective. The young woman who had spoken earlier smiled at Ernest. "You really are something else, sir," she said. He chuckled softly. "I'm just an old man with too many stories and not enough time to tell them all." The bus ride continued without further incident, but the atmosphere had shifted. Ernest's quiet strength had left an impression on everyone, from the teenagers to the silent bystanders who had watched the scene unfold. When the bus finally arrived at his stop, Ernest stood slowly, his cane steadying him as he moved toward the exit. As he passed the driver, the man tipped his cap. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said. Ernest nodded. "You take care now." As the bus pulled away, Ernest made his way down the quiet street toward his home. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. He smiled to himself, thinking of the small victory he'd won that day. Not just for himself, but for the lesson he'd passed on. Life had taught him that dignity wasn't something anyone could give or take away. It was something you carried within, unshaken by the storms of ignorance or hate. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would continue to stand as a testament to that truth. Drop a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.